So let me start by saying hello, everyone, and welcome to this Oxford International webinar. We've had a great interest and very excited to have you all with us today. My name is Alex Korda. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Oxford International. First, I want to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Bhandari and our panelists, who also took the time to contribute to this paper that Dr. Bhandari developed with and for us. The paper was released earlier this month and is called "The Lack of Diversity Spells Adversity: Why US Institutions Need to Attract Diverse International Students." So why this topic? We've been in the education sector for a good 30 years. This year, we're actually celebrating 10 years in higher education. Our mission is to support international students, help them succeed on their education journey, whilst, of course, helping US institutions execute their internationalization strategies to grow for the long term and to have lasting student outcomes. We focus on quality, we focus on customized solution and vertical integration with our higher ed partners. And we have a multitude of products. We have English language proficiency and higher education readiness. We have academic pathways that we typically embed within universities. We have 2 in the US and Estonia. We probably mention later on many more in the making, in the works, and 7 in the UK. We have direct entry international recruitment and admissions for universities in the US, but also the UK and Australia. So to cut the long story short, our efforts focus on diversifying our university partners' student body. And we know that when students are well integrated, they bring enormous benefits. So it only felt right to start the development of this year's set of reports and papers with this topic. Also, given all of the recent shifts in source markets, in student needs, and the overall mobility trends. So without further ado, I would like to pass the baton to Dr. Bhandari to share a few highlights from the paper and then moderate a discussion that I expect will be very, very insightful. So over to you, Rajika.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome to all of us, Alex, and to our participants. It's been an absolute pleasure to partner with you all on this paper. And what I'm going to do is take just a very brief few minutes to share some highlights from the paper and then move on to what is really the highlight of this webinar, which is a discussion with our wonderful panelists. And I will introduce them in a few minutes right before we begin our discussion. And in sharing about the paper, I want to say that I'm not going to do a big presentation or go into a lot of details, because our goal is that you should go read the paper if you haven't already read it. So I'm just going to put out some teasers that will hopefully encourage you to do just that. And what we really want to do is use the webinar and the discussion with our panelists and with you all to really sort of bring to life some of the issues that we hope the paper raises. So just a quick overview of what the focus of the paper is. And, you know, at the outset, what I want to say is that of course, for those of us who are in this sector and space, the issue of international student diversity itself is not necessarily new. But what is new and different is really the current imperative for institutions to diversify, and the very clear and present need, which has really never been greater. And that's for a few different reasons that we highlight in the report and that we'll get into the discussion as well, including the very significant demographic shifts that the US is facing, which will ultimately lead to what has been called the enrollment cliff. The fact that there is a significant global competition to attract talented international students, and other countries are trying to do so as well. And a really important fact that students have choice. Students are savvy decision makers now and armed with information. And, the US is not the only country in the game, and students have choices. But most importantly, and one thing that we really emphasize in the report is that attracting students from diverse backgrounds is not just about an optimal recruitment strategy, but is in fact central to the mission of US institutions, especially as we sort of live in an environment where the idea of access and inclusion is front and center of everything that we do. So that's sort of the why behind the paper. Some of the other aspects we focus on, and again, I'm not going to say too much because I want to dig into these themes with our panelists, but what exactly do we mean by international student diversity? This term is thrown around pretty randomly, and there's sort of this assumption that, well, we should all know what this means. But in fact, there's no clear understanding of this, and it's something that we try and unpack in the report. We also drill down into what are some key trends in the mobility patterns and motivations of students from some different countries that might represent diverse countries, particularly from the global south. And then perhaps most importantly, in terms of being an action-oriented paper, what can institutions do with all of this information as they themselves are trying to diversify? And in fact, we do include 4 case studies in the paper, and I'm very grateful to both Samrat and Ravi for having shared with us what their institutions are doing in this regard. I want to share a couple of quick data points, just again to ground our discussion. So when we think of international student diversity, and to the extent that we're thinking about where students are coming from, a lot of the focus is on the global south. Again, one big reason being that really that's where the future student growth is going to come from. And if we look at just 2 metrics, by 2030, which is not very far away, almost half of the world's future talent is going to come from the continent of Africa alone. And when we look at India, which of course is a big topic of conversation when we talk about student mobility, by that time, India's youth population will be touching 270 million. So really, again, when we think of where are these diverse students coming from, we see this predominance of both Africa and South Asia. Can we move to the next one, please? So we drilled down into 4 key countries in this report: India, Nigeria, Vietnam, Pakistan. A few reasons for selecting them were that all 4 of them have a massive youth population, which is only slated to grow. So again, that's where a lot of the future growth is going to come from. The gross enrollment ratio is rapidly growing and student aspirations are strong. But I also want to mention that we lay out in the report some key differences in motivations across these 4 countries, that as institutions think about how do you attract students, it's not one size fits all, and there are some key differences in what motivates students. I want to mention India. Now, you may well say, well, India is already a top sending country. How does it represent diversity? The reason we include India is that it's a very, when it comes to student motivations, it's a very complex country. And also a feature that we really highlight in the report is that there is tremendous diversity amongst Indian students and across India, which we believe has been untapped. And I'm hoping that in the discussion, Samrat will shed some light on this. Moving on to the next. So we talked about demand, but what is the current reality and what's the situation? Now, if we just look overall at who comes to the US, and many of you are familiar with this data, it comes from the Open Doors report. It really shows us that not much has changed over time. A few Asian countries still tend to predominate. That's the orange bar. But again, when you look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the darker blue bar, it's all the way at the bottom. So again, we sort of have a demand and supply issue here, that there's strong demand from a certain region, but it's not necessarily reflected in current enrollment trends. And I want to share one other snapshot with you that sort of presents this in a very stark way. Now, I know this is very tiny. Don't worry about the print on the graph. All I want you to look at is the purple part of the bar graph for each of these. And what this is laying out, and this comes from some of the excellent analysis by Holland IQ, this lays it out by state. And what it's basically showing us is that when you look at the top host states for international students in the US, you can see how tiny that purple part of the bar is for those states. And that's, again, African students. So again, I'm trying to highlight the fact that we've got this huge potential upcoming demand for students from certain diverse regions. But for whatever reason, it's not yet reflected in the actual makeup of the student body. So with that, I want to move on to really digging into these issues. And I would like to introduce our wonderful panel. And I'm going to start with Ravi Shankar, who's the Assistant Vice Provost for International Services and Support at the University of Rochester. And Ravi has spent over 30 years in this space, being at ranging from small schools to community colleges to large research institutions. And some of you may also know that he's a former past president and board chair of NAFSA and is very, very involved with NAFSA. Next is Tonya, who is the Vice President for Higher Education in the US with Oxford International. And Tonya has, over the past decade, driven the expansion of international student access with over 50 institutions across the US, and she really remains dedicated to expanding options for international students and really brings that passion to this topic. And last but not the least is Samrat Chaudhuri, who's the Assistant Vice President for International Enrollment at Webster University. And he brings extensive knowledge and expertise in higher education administration based on all of his work in Asia and now in the US. And his work has spanned functions like student affairs, career counseling, admissions, and of course, enrollment management. And before we get into our discussion, I also want to note that at least two of our panelists, both Ravi and Samrat, have been former international students to the US. So without further ado, let's jump right into what promises to be a great discussion. And before we begin, I just want to mention that please put all of your questions in the Q&A box. That's where we'll be pulling questions from when we open it up for Q&A with all of you. So please remember to add your questions there. And I'll remind you a few times during our conversation. So welcome, Ravi, Tonya, and Samrat. It's wonderful to have you join in this conversation. And thank you again also for all of your contributions to the paper itself. So just to get us started, I had my spiel at the beginning, but we want to hear directly from you, and especially from two of you who are based on campuses, that, why is diversity such an imperative at this point in time, and not just a sort of nice to have or just not a nice concept, but why is it really critical? And Ravi, let's start with your thoughts.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Rajika, I should mention that you were also an international student, yes. Right? Yes, so we do bring a wealth of experience. And I think I'd like to to answer that question, really, I think, and I think this is really highlighted in the paper itself. But I think there, notwithstanding the issue of revenue, which is the bottom line that I think is we're all concerned about, I think there are a number of factors I think that go into it, and I think one of the latest one, of course, is the 2023 U.S. Supreme Court decision about the institutions not able to account for race, and I think we have now data that shows that I think the number of students going to, HBCUs have now on the increase in the last, since that decision. So there is that, and there is also the enrollment cliff that we all talk about in 2025 and beyond. And I think, so institutions are playing, are concerned about how do we balance, not only the incoming cohort of students, but, where are the students coming from in addition to the challenges of DEI or JEDI in several of the states, that we're currently facing, well, at least some of our colleagues are, facing. But I think there is this, issue of, how is it related to the institution's mission and strategic goals? Right? For example, is your mission, is the strategic plan in your institution that calls for global learning, which necessarily means that I think there has to be a diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, diversity of experiences, learned behavior, learned experience. There's a richness that international students lend to the fabric, and also and to DI, and that's just forecasting. I think the next question that we're going to be discussing. But I think overall, I think it is that diversity of thought, that richness, that perspective that international students bring to the intellectual discourse, within campuses, of course, and also how do we then, of course, the challenge always is it's nice, it's great that they lend their discourse and their experience to campuses, but how are we, how is it disseminated through the community, which is outside of the campuses, right? So there are those issues as well, because institutions don't live, on their own. So I think that's sort of, I think I'll leave it at that, because I think there's a lot more that Samrat and I think Tonya are going to add to that.
Well, thank you for getting us started, and you laid out a number of different aspects of the, to this question. But Samrat, what are your thoughts on sort of reactions to what Ravi said, or other things you'd like to add?
Well, I think Ravi very eloquently, as expected, laid it out in front of us with all those information. I think he mentioned the imperatives as like, financial, enrollment cliff, diversity of minds, culture, the Supreme Court decision, and all those different points. As a person who represents a private higher education institution, I would say we are also looking at risk mitigation as a factor. We do not want to put all eggs in one basket. It's more of a, not just financial, but also from programmatic angles. Like we see a trend that, in certain countries, the dominant group kind of determines which program students are going to flock to. And in a liberal arts institution, we cannot just survive with offering 4 programs, because that defeats the purpose of the institution. So we want to diversify intentionally to ensure that we are reaching out to students who are not just going to follow their friends and families in terms of coming to choosing programs that are critical to a liberal arts institution like us. So for example, I mean, if you are looking at a program like a music major, we hardly get any students from Hyderabad, from where most of our graduate students come. But we might find some students in Vietnam through certain programs, or in China, or in in Mexico, you name it. So there are reasons, or even other places within India. So there are reasons for us to mitigate that risk of a program closure, not just a revenue loss. So the conservative way of conserving these programs that are important to our mission.
Thank you. And you've kind of taken us in a really interesting direction, and I want to hold that thought about sort of what are those different vectors of diversification, but quickly go to Tonya. And Tonya, anything to add or reflect on what's already been said? And then I want to get in, or just taking Samrat's point further, if that's what you want to build out on sort of, what are these, when we talk about international student diversity, what are those different ways in which someone could represent a diverse international student? So yeah, whatever you would like to add or reflect on.
Thank you so much. I think as we watch these changing the political landscape with some of the sunsetting of DEI policies, I think another imperative for that diversity is that we are bringing inclusivity into our institutions and into the surrounding communities. We can only help the shopkeepers that manage a store that's often visited by students. We can only help them become more tolerant and understanding of other cultures if we bring those cultures to them, if they're not going out. So I absolutely agree that there's so many aspects, risk mitigation, another one. Exactly, we see this kind of quiet reduction of liberal arts and the shrinking of these programs. And that's such an important aspect of education and of thought and of philosophy. And without that, I get concerned about where in particular, the American, where our culture is going without those important disciplines.
Yes, absolutely. So let's build up this idea further. What exactly are some of those different areas of, or sort of emerging growth areas for diversifying international students? And, again, we can look at diversity in terms of what are some sending countries, and that's sort of where the mind immediately goes. When you think of international student diversity, we immediately start thinking about what's the untapped capacity in certain countries and regions. And certainly I too began with that in some of the slides that I shared, because again, just in terms of what's the data available, that's really information that's readily available, but we don't know as much about diversity of disciplines and programs of study that you all began to touch upon, that there's diversity there as well, because as we all know, currently international students sort of predominate in the STEM fields, and that's sort of really quite a bit of the focus. But that we can look at sending countries, we can look at disciplines, we can look at programs of study, as you've already also begun to raise. And then we can look at diversity within a country. So let's unpack that a little bit. And Samrat, I know you already began to talk about programs of study, but let's actually turn to you to talk about a country and talk about India, because I think one of the things that has been really interesting for me is, how you shared in the paper how Webster has really made inroads into not just, of course, recruiting from India, which almost every campus is doing, but really thinking about the diversity within India. So if you could share a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure. So, I mean, like many of the campuses in the US, we use a program called Slate, and it gives a wonderful, data spread in terms of where students are coming from and all kinds of reports. So I was playing with it about a year ago, and I was intrigued to see that within India, how many of them came from a single state or even a single city, and or a combination, and it was always the same program. So that's kind of like what I was looking at recruiters and reports, and I saw that what was happening essentially was this flow of students from this one particular region. And then I asked myself, is that the only place where India is sending students to? So long story short, this place was Hyderabad and Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. For those of you who know, it's a southern state, very popular for American, higher ed. Almost everyone is out there recruiting either directly or with agents. And back in the days, a few years ago, it used to be Gujarat, Ahmedabad, and it's still kind of like it plays between Hyderabad and Ahmedabad and so forth, so on and so forth. So, but India, as I see it, being from the country originally, has so many other places where students are very much excited and going to the US, but you'll be surprised that maybe they are not really very aware of how to go there. So there's a lack of awareness in India, and this was not tapped into. There's a lack of awareness of coming to the US that is not as mass scale, when I say, as it has been in Hyderabad. So that led us to think about, like, how we can tap into other places. And what was a beautiful journey so far, has been a beautiful journey, is that we are seeing that when you go to other parts of India and you go to meet school counselors, when you meet the agents, when you meet the students directly, you see that you are not only restricted to those 4 programs that are sending every, Hyderabadi student to the campus. So we are again seeing an interest in psychology, in business, in mathematics, in education, and so on and so forth. So we are still in the process. I won't say that we have completely re-strategized, because out of 3,000 Indian students that we host in our campuses, we are predominantly still from the southern states, a lot of them. But I would say that we have seen some remarkable progress in this, and it's very exciting to see how these students are coming to different programs, like international relations. We are getting students from India. So these other smaller programs like criminology, for example, these programs, anything that has an ability to offer on-ground classes, are kind of rejuvenating post-COVID, because there was a tendency of shifting everything online. Now with these students, we are seeing students coming back to the campus, bringing a critical mass together for doing those classes. And that's kind of happened. I don't think it would have happened if we just focused on Hyderabad, Telangana, like the usual. So that's kind of like where I would kind of put a pause, and then maybe, you can ask me more questions and I can be more specific in terms of what the journey
And
has
one
been.
thing I'd like to add is sort of from the student perspective, right? That we tend to get so focused on the STEM piece. What about all the other international students who are pursuing other fields? And this is a point that I'm very sensitive about, because I'm a social scientist. I came to the US to study psychology and education. I wasn't in a STEM field, and there are thousands of students like that, and sort of this almost exclusive focus, or dare I say obsession, with kind of the STEM international student really also takes away from perhaps focusing as much on the needs and well-being of students and other programs of study. Ravi and Tonya, anything to sort of add to this, and sort of either diversity of programs or location and geography? Anything you'd like to add?
Tonya, would you like to go? Or okay, so no, I think I agree, but I think so I'm sort of looking at it from particularly for Indian students, right? That is all about our ROI, right? And what is the value proposition for them in terms of the disciplines that they pursue. And I think and I agree with Samrat, and I saw this happening, prior to COVID, at my last institution, where I think there was a shift in going to non-STEM, degree disciplines, right? And so, but then I think after COVID, I think I've seen a swing back to STEM, STEM focus. And I think that's only because I think 2 reasons. I think one is, of course, I think they're looking at what is the demand for me if I get a degree in psychology back in India, for example, right? Or in journalism, given the political, situation or the narratives of whatever country they're from, and if it's happened to be in India particularly. And then I think I think the other issue, of course, I also see is that I think in the United States, we have made sure that STEM has been the focus, and everything that we do in terms of our immigration regulations is all STEM focused, right? We get 3 years of OPT for STEM related degrees. Even the State Department has jumped on this early career J1, academic training for STEM. So I think it is also the way we actually also speak to the international students and their parents about, you know, what is important to them. And so I think I think that maybe we need to also switch to really, I think, review and look and reflect upon how we are selling these disciplines, other disciplines. I'm sorry, selling is probably the bad word because we're in education. So how do we, talk about these other disciplines and how they relate to their, return on investments and their career opportunities, whether it's in the United States or not? Because one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about and talking to our career officers is that, should jobs necessarily be in the United States? Because we live in a global economy, can we globalize our career opportunities to other countries? I mean, there's 180, 190, however many countries we have. So I think we're looking at, really, I think we're in such a nascent state in terms of the discussion about how do we talk about, non-STEM disciplines, I think is sort of the critical point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, and I'm
Yeah.
so glad you mentioned the policies and the OPT issue, because one downside of it is like when I'm talking to students on campuses, it's almost disheartening to see that very often that sort of the 3 years of the STEM OPT weighs so heavily and skews things so much that students are actually often making choices of what they want to study based on the practicality and opportunities represented by those 3 years versus 1 year. And that's unfortunate, because that's not how students should be making their decisions about what they want to study and what they aspire to.
Yeah.
And yet,
absolutely. I just had this intense discussion with our political science department. They wanted to make political science at their master's level of STEM, right? And not the PhD program, but just the master's. So it's sort of this interesting dynamic that's kind of built into how we,
I do want to add one point, if I may, that, to Ravi's point and to what you were alluding to, Rajika, a lot of the focus for Indian students or students in general from international students is the ROI for sure. And I have found it easier to have those conversations with students and families when it came to undergraduate students rather than master's degree students. So a lot of our initiatives that we are doing are focused on undergraduate in India, which is a huge topic, perhaps a topic in itself, in how the growth potentials are in that region. And that is where I'm finding a lot more acceptance for non-STEM programs and the diversity in programs. And honestly speaking, that is kind of like how we need to even look at it in different baskets, graduate versus undergraduate, and then go into the STEM versus non-STEM program. So if you try to change, I mean, the structure of graduate students, to non-STEM, that might not be as successful. And that's because they are looking at, like, what's my next job, immediately. So that's kind of the value proposition that I see.
I would argue also that the US really is a magnet for anybody who wants to pursue advanced studies in sciences and engineering and go on to that doctoral level or postdoctoral research or academia, etc.
Exactly.
But I want to go to Tonya now, because I know she's been wanting to say something. And then Tonya, let's hear quickly from you. And then I want to move on to a couple of other themes.
Well, I think we're talking about, like, where's the growth coming from. I did want to reference something you speak about in the paper, which is what I've been seeing with our partner institutions from Vietnam. We saw an almost doubling of application and interest, and of course they have a nice, strong, typical visa acquisition rate. So that's been really good for our partners. With respect to degree, I agree with you, Sam, and I'm glad you brought it up about about undergraduate being a completely different conversation, particularly with students from India. I'm seeing a lot of interest in health sciences that are non-STEM, like biology, people that are interested in medicine, long-term public health, things like hospitality, restaurant, sports management, athletic science. I think one of the interesting challenges is something that the whole world needs more of are nurses and healthcare practitioners, but the nursing degrees in the US are typically not STEM designated. And that's actually deterring a lot of international students from those fields of study, because why would they invest that to get a US nursing credential that could only be utilized for maybe 1 year of OPT? So really interesting to see how this conversation continues to evolve. But I'm so glad you brought up the undergraduate population, because I do understand that is a trend shift from India, that we've always had strong interest for grad programs, but that we're seeing greater demand for undergrad.
Yeah, I love this sort of the bringing together of the academic discipline, the academic level, and of course sort of framing it with the issue of sort of diversifying in all of these different ways. So I want to move on to challenges, because this all sounds great. Everybody wants to diversify. I think all institutions would declare that as an aspiration, but there are some clear challenges to doing so. So I want to get into that, and I want to start with visas. And today's one of the headlines in the Chronicle of Higher Education this morning was about the recent low visa approval rate for Indian students and how that's plummeted. So I want to start with visas and visa approval rates. And I know you all have some strong ideas and opinions about this, because again, the challenge here is that if on the one hand, we're talking about diversification of location and geography and program of study within country, etc., what about the reality of visa barriers and those students actually getting into the US? So I'm going to open it up for whoever wants to go first and would like to respond to this.
I can jump in because I monitor it a lot, which are the global visa wait times. So what I think is really interesting is to see how quickly that can change. I pull it off of the Department of Homeland Security. I pull that off every couple of weeks because I like to watch the trends. And you can see, for example, Calcutta, there was in early October, it was a 183-day wait, and today it's 70. So I think with respect to improving students' opportunities to get their visa, we need to think about how we're coaching them and where they're actually going, where they're applying, and staying on top of those trends can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go with how we strategize in terms of, like working with our students in terms of making sure that they are, able to get the visa. So there are 3 primary areas we focus on. First of all, we follow the availability of slots or interview slots that Tonya just referred to. The other thing which is interesting to see is the number of approval or rejection information that is coming across a certain embassy or a certain region. And third is looking into your own pipeline of I-20s, how many have you issued, and seeing and ensuring that if there is something that could have happened better. So quickly into the first point is like, for example, India, the US embassies have already announced that they will allow student interviews typically in 2 periods during the year. So fall 1, that is the early fall, and spring. So for us, we are our graduate programs are rolling admissions, so you can come every 5 intakes. But since we know those visas are going to only come into areas, we have counseled students and told them to apply only for these programs. So we are prepared, and we are telling them don't apply for this fall 2 and spring 2 and all those other summer programs, so that your DSOs are not bogged down into reissuing I-20s. That's one area. The other area for the approval rates, whenever you're looking at it, you can contact your embassies and you can ask them for information. Usually U.S. embassies are prompt in letting you know where you are going, a little wrong. You can ask the State Department, organizations like Education USA and so on and so forth, where they can guide you a little bit. Like we were sending a lot of students earlier who were rejected because we didn't have any control of how many times we could issue an I-20 to the same student. So we modified our policy to kind of like to back it up such that it is not more than twice for a student who is rejected, because if you are sending the same student who has been rejected for again and again and again, then the approval rate is obviously going to be lower. The third aspect is the critical aspect of like reviewing where and how you're doing things. So for example, a lot of the times the students are getting rejected for not having ties to the country and so on and so forth. So we looked into our areas of what we were doing. So for example, one of the things that we implemented was to ask for 3 months bank statement instead of just the final available balance on your institutional, on your account or your sponsor's account. And that kind of helps us to mitigate in identifying students who are really qualified with financial resources in terms of coming here and not landing into trouble, or advising them to go for an education loan up front so that it's all done on those kinds of premises. Now, twigging that, we have seen some success for example, in terms of approval rates, but it's a combination of all these things that you need to keep in your control. The rest is not in our control. If an officer decides, or if the government is not going to open up slots, like in Africa, we are giving I-20s way early, like about a year ahead, so that we're taking advantage of the recent changes in rules that you can issue an I-20 about a year in advance. So we are telling our students basically, don't take an I-20 if you are going to apply for a program that starts in 3 months. You should apply for something that starts much later in order to mitigate that wait period. So kind of like all of that.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful to sort of think about this from a really strategic perspective. Ravi, quick response from you, and then I know we have a few minutes where I want to talk about actual solutions. We talk about challenges, but let's talk about solutions as well. But over to you, Ravi, on sort of the challenge piece.
I think one of the things that I think a huge challenge, of course, is the financial aid, right? In terms of and how you structure the financial aid. I was talking to our undergraduate admissions people, and she was sharing, she got almost 500 applications from Pakistan, out of which less than 1% could actually pay. The rest of them were all, high demand, high need students, and with limited, financial aid resources. I think it presents a huge problem, in talking about how do you sort of continuously diversify your international student body, because, a lot of them that do apply are very, very qualified, but are not able to afford to come. And so how do you structure your financial aid in your institutions? What are your priorities for financial aid, et cetera? I think is also, I think, something that we need to kind of think about, I think, in terms of, I think one of the challenges, aside from the visa issues.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'll just quickly mention for our participants here, I have another new report coming out in just a couple of weeks. That's a deep dive into the whole funding situation for international students, and that's in partnership with the President's Alliance. So please stay tuned for that, because we address the sorts of issues that Ravi raised. Tonya, I think you already responded to this. Should we move on to, did you have something to say on the challenges, or should we move on to solutions?
Let's move to the solutions. That's the
Okay,
good
let's
stuff.
move to the solutions, because we have just a few minutes left, and I do want to address the questions that have come in through the chat as well. So, I want to mention to everyone that in the paper, we do lay out some very clear suggestions and recommendations for what campuses can do. We don't have time to go deep into all of them, but what I'll share quickly is that we have 5 key takeaways for US campuses. And within each of those, we have specific recommendations. The first is aligning international student strategy with campus-wide diversity efforts. Number 2 is leveraging technology and digital engagement for things like student outreach and recruitment and academic programming. Number 3 is fostering diversity by creating an inclusive environment for international students through cultural programming, network building, and staff and faculty training, which is critical. The 4th is enhancing support services for a diverse international student body. And last but not the least, we have some specific recommendations around strengthening partnerships with global institutions and school systems, both at the secondary and post-secondary level in other countries. So before we open it up, Tonya, I want to give you the last opportunity to any sort of quick thoughts on solutions and strategies.
Yes, I am really passionate about this. And I think that to speak to something that Sam and Ravi both mentioned with respect to making sure your students have the finances to come and that making those scholarships available, I think another thing that institutions can do to ensure both of those things is to consider your deposit. I know a lot of universities barely charge any, if at all, any deposit, $100. That's not going to show a financial commitment on part of the student. And so I think that considering those sorts of things can then allow you to open up other opportunities and different access points, such as while you mentioned, Sam, the sort of intake focus, but when we're talking about a greater diversity, the more intakes, as you mentioned, you're 5, that's amazing, the more intakes you can welcome a student to campus, whether it's summer, spring, and fall, whether it's a quarter system, whether it's even a late start. Some institutions have rolled that into their programming so that students who get that visa at the last minute can go ahead and come. I think that's really helpful, reducing the barriers. So one of the things you write about, Rajika, is with respect to, for example, students from Nigeria and their career focus. So a lot of graduate programs require a resume, and I used to work with international students and their resume building, and they very much don't look like anything that an American resume would look like. So wondering, is that resume truly going to help a program director make a decision about the student, or are we just putting another barrier up to prevent that student from coming? There's so many ways that we can increase access, and thinking about it from a much wider angle, I think will invite greater diversity just in that of itself.
Well, thank you for that. So I'm going to go to questions. And I'm going to start with something that's on everyone's minds. And this comes from Nicole Kenny. And the question is, does the political spectrum, and weighing largely on next week's election result and similar to visa changes in the UK, which made it deterrence for international applicants and their families, will this political outcome work in favor or not of helping grow that international promotion? So basically the gist of the question being, what impact do we think the outcome may or may not have? And so whoever wants to take it away, and let's make the responses as quick as possible. So any quick snappy thoughts, because we have a couple of other questions I'd like to get to. Samrat.
I think, there was a report recently at study portals, and they kind of like alluded us to the fact that it doesn't really affect the mindset of the students, but how politics will play a role in actual granting of visa and the barriers that's to be seen based on which government comes to power.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's what history has also shown, that it'll be the actual shift in policies, if any, pertaining to all of those things that affect international students, whether it's the F1 issuance or the extent of OPT. Let's remind everybody that OPT always hangs in the balance because it was never created by legislation. So it's very, very fragile and fraught. So yes, so I guess it will be all of that. Okay, so any other quick thoughts on that? We can move on to the next question.
I just think that all of the major Anglophone destinations right now have their own challenges. So the outcome of our political election is just one thing in the bucket as compared to other places that students want to study. I know that's also changing. It used to be that the student would decide where to study before they would decide, like in terms of a location, before they would decide the institution or even their major. And I think that same article, Sam, I think there's seeing some shift where a lot of students would consider another country just based on the availability and access to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think the only thing I would add, Rajika, is that in addition to what Tonya and Sam have mentioned, I'm really concerned about, how it will impact our ability to support international students if there is, any policies that, that are enacted, whether it's executive order or through legislation, and how that impacts our ability to actually have a base and have the resources to support students.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very, very good point. And thank you for that, Ravi. Okay, so I'm going to come back to something that Samrat and Tonya, both of you had already begun to talk about, which is that academic level issue. And we have a question, and so perhaps you could address this issue more clearly, more directly now, where the question is, are you seeing an increase of bachelor's level students from India in other regions of India? I think perhaps the question means this from Stephanie Ziscal. I think the question means, are you seeing an increase of bachelor's level students from other parts of India? Or is it spread evenly across India? Are you seeing any variations?
We are seeing from all across India, and especially places where there are international schools or English language curriculum, we are seeing a resurgence of students kind of coming back to the US to study. And we are seeing a lot more, I would say, positive success with the visa. We have grown nearly 45% year on year since COVID, and currently we are almost at about at a stage where we need to look through more resources in order to continue recruiting. So I think in India, I would say for undergraduate, it is all over India, depending on where you have your connections and who you're working with. So yeah, it is pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Tonya, anything to add to that, different from what Samrat shared? Okay, and then I'm going to go to the last question. We have two more that have come in. So one is about this one is about STEM. And I think the question, it says, I work in higher education in the UK. This is also by Nicole Kenny. STEM courses and those aimed at women and applicants overseas are being passionately promoted over here as a future focus. How do STEM courses correlate in the US among women and international interests? So basically, are we seeing any variations by gender in how international students are attracted to the US for STEM fields? Are there any variations in pattern?
I'm really glad at that question, because I was thinking of some of your other work, Rajika. We typically see about only 30% of the students coming into the US are female from international sources. And so I think that correlates into the STEM fields, but there are with respect to non-STEM, I think we're seeing a lot of with an entrepreneurial aspect or a business aspect, sort of more interdisciplinary elements that seem to be also very attractive to the women coming in. I would love to ask you, Rajika, if what your data tells us.
Yeah, I'm seeing some interesting trends in some other aspects of the sector. For example, one of the large studies I was involved in looking at no cosigner, no collateral loans by companies like Empower Financing have shown some really interesting trends where their data shows that it's actually open the door to more international women students coming to the US for STEM fields. And our understanding is that it's really the availability of the loan, where the student does not need the family's blessing, has a lot to do with women being able to follow through on those aspirations, because many of them may be coming from societies where families don't want to make that huge investment in their daughters going on to study in the STEM fields, etc. So there's some very interesting social dynamics at play here as well. Yeah, overall, what I always like to say is, we have a global problem when it comes to women and STEM, and this is not unique to international students. So it's something that we continue to need to focus on both globally to, make sure that more girls and women continue to pursue the STEM fields, but also most definitively in the context of this conversation for international students who are women as well. Last question, which is, I'm really glad someone asked about community colleges, and this will be the last one. We have 3 minutes left. It comes from Calvin Lester, and the question is, how would you advise community college representatives who are seeking to bring students to their campuses?
I can speak to what our global sales team tells us, which is that because of the shift toward more price sensitivity, community colleges offer a really great value proposition to international students. But getting more savvy about the needs of those students and being able to support them with transfer advising, having existing articulation agreements in place. The more articulation agreements you can have, the better. Those are just some quick takeaways that I would strongly suggest.
So I'll jump into this. I think many U.S. institutions are facing some, universities are facing some challenge about transfer routes. So a lot of students who come from countries which are price sensitive or destinations which are price sensitive tend to come in with a visa of one university and go to a community college to study. There's a perception issue, which is that if you are going with a community college I-20, you might not get the visa, which may or may not be true. And the reason I say that is because when I ask U.S. Embassy folks, they say that they don't discriminate based on a community college or not, but that's a perception out there. So I would say one of the strategies community colleges should work on is to see if institutions are willing to do a dual enrollment program so that they don't get dinged for transfer outs in their rankings. U.S. News will critically look into this if your average retention is dropping, and there's an interest in the institution. And like Tonya says, these articulation agreements can also then make these students come back after 2 years in a much more smoother way. So I think look into those kinds of areas, and that'll be one thing to look into. In my opinion, there are lots of things which are happening in the Middle East. Look for those, especially the Vision 2030. I think that's what they're talking about in the Middle East, and that is another area for community colleges to look into.
Well, we have reached the end of this fabulous discussion. I just saw a question come in, so I'll just answer it live. Someone asked which was the visa report that I mentioned. It was an article, one of the headline articles in today's Chronicle of Higher Education. It's by Karen Fisher, whom many of you know. It's her lead article in today's issue of the Chronicle, so you can go find it there. And I want to first off thank Oxford International for commissioning this work on such an important topic, and to really thank all of our panelists for bringing this topic alive in all of its nuances. Clearly, there's a lot to be done, but I'm glad we're having the conversation and really beginning to unpack what exactly we mean with international student diversity. And thank you all for joining us. And I really encourage you to please go download the paper and Yes, here we have it, the QR code. So please download the paper, and thank you so much again for joining us.